It is time. So, all right, continuing on, we're at the next line, which is at first seems really short, but you could really spend a lot of time on this. It
And we
is
already have. Prepping for
we
this
already did
episode.
a lot of prep before this. So the line is suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. I mean, referring to Christ, right? I believe Jesus Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. So this first part, suffered under Pontius Pilate, is an interesting one. And I don't think I realized until I was a teaching assistant uh, that a lot of people are not familiar with this. Like even people who grew up in the church, and I'm not knocking them, because how often do we really talk about this? So one of the students spoke up when we did this line in the Apostles' Creed, and they said, "What is Pontius Pilate?" Like I don't know what that is.
It's like a
Uh,
Jeopardy answer. What is Pontius Pilate?
yeah, exactly. And some of the students, kind of
Lost in the
laughed, and I
500?
just, yeah. Um, I mean, I felt bad for him though.
No,
Like,
I know.
but it was an
I mean,
honest question, which I really appreciated. And I was like, that is actually a good question. Let's talk about that. Why do we have this line in the creed? Like, why is that important to say that Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate? Why not just say Christ suffered? So this line is important in a few ways. One, so Pontius Pilate was a Roman official who was over. I think it was a governor over Israel at that time. So he was the one in charge of like overseeing, a lot of government stuff, and he was the one who uh, questioned Jesus on a couple times, and actually ended up making the final decision to crucify him. And that's significant for a couple reasons. One is because it brings about historical context, which uh, is fairly significant because there have been arguments by um, people who are very critical of Christianity that Christians really could follow a variety of religious figures who have a lot of the same claims. Like, they were born of a virgin, they had the title the Son of God, they were killed, and then they were resurrected. They had a following of like 12 close, disciples, if you want to use that term. So a lot of similarities, which, fair enough, that's true. But this is really grounding our belief in Jesus Christ in a very specific historical place and time. Because Pontius Pilate was a historical figure. He's noted by several non biblical sources who refer to him. So that is one of the significant things. Like when we talk about Jesus, we're talking about someone who actually lived in first century Palestine or Israel, whatever term you want to use, uh, and actually around the same time as this figure of Pontius Pilate, um, which I think is significant. And one of the reasons why that's significant is um,
he
I'm
grounds.
blanking on that story. I was gonna tell that Mormon story. Okay. So several years ago, I had a friend. They grew up Christian, and then through several events, they ended up meeting someone who was Mormon, got into a pretty serious relationship, and they had a hard time reconciling Mormonism with Christianity. So they actually began to explore a lot of the differences in the faith claims. And at first, it was more of a defense of Mormonism, of saying, Mormons are actually Christian, and here are the reasons because we claim this, Christianity claims this, it's the same thing. But actually, after a while, that person ended up really rejecting Mormonism and saying, these aren't the same things. Like there are very significant differentiating points where the claims of Christianity simply don't match up to the claims of Mormonism. Yeah, they might have some similarities, um, some some significant similarities, but the differences are different enough that you can't ignore them, and they're significant enough that they're simply not compatible. And this is one of those points because it grounds Jesus as a figure who lived in first century Israel, who was a Jew, who grew up in that culture, grew up in that time. Uh, so this is actually a very significant line, and that's just one of the reasons. We'll get into a couple more. Britt, I don't know if you want to chime in
Yeah.
here on any of that.
I think it's significant for exactly the reason you said that it really grounds in the history of this whole of the line and of who Jesus is, right? Like it's rooting him in a historical event, connecting him with a historical person. So, I mean, we got to think about it this way, right? Like when this event is happening, there is no CNN or Fox News or NBC, CBS. Like there's not live coverage of the crucifixion. That doesn't happen. That's not a thing. And that sounds kind of funny and goofy to say out loud, but like you got to remove that ability to have access to news quickly from your context, which is really hard for us because of the world we live in. So everything that imagine if everything you had to go on was word of mouth. Now, every single one of us, I think, has probably played a game of telephone in elementary school at some point, or maybe even later. And you know how easy it is that you just mishear things or you misinterpret it because you're trying to do like three things at once, or you're only half
Mhm.
listening, or maybe you just aren't very good at comprehending things. I don't know. It could be any of those different things. So stories get twisted and things get shifted. So it's important for the Christians, and at least in my opinion, I wonder if there's a reason that they include this line to tie him in, Jesus, that is, and his life and his death and his crucifixion to an historical person that we know does actually judge on crucifixions, right? And we know the story. We've heard the gospel story, right? I wash my hands of this. This is the man that you've chosen, but it
Yeah.
validates that too. It really kind of leads it in there. And so it's important on two fronts. From a historical perspective, I think that that's what they were trying to accomplish. I don't know that for certain, but it's a significant claim. And in a modern perspective, Ben, you've touched on this. Like there are many critics of the Christian faith, and that's fine. Like that's fair. We need to be able to stand up and engage in criticism in a healthy way. Criticism isn't bad. It's
Mhm.
constructive. Only well, it's not bad if it's constructive. Sometimes people don't want to have like an honest conversation. In which case, probably not worth taking the criticism. But
Right.
for our purposes here, like let's say it is an honest conversation. Someone's like, "Hey, I don't think Pontius Pilate existed," and we have sources that indicate otherwise. It's a really big claim for us because this is part of that event. And Ben, correct me if I'm wrong. I would say if we're really going to summarize the significance of the biblical message overall and of Christian theism, like the name Christ is in the name for a reason, right? Like the life of Jesus, including his death, and then ultimately what we'll talk about next week or the week after, the resurrection.
Yeah, that's the next one.
That's the next one. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll make sure I was organized on this one. I didn't have the creed in front of me to check
Yeah.
what week we're on. Um,
Oh, I guess it would be 2 weeks because this one will probably be split up into two parts. So
okay. Well,
whatever.
whenever we get to the resurrection, that part as well. Forgive us, listeners. Forgive us. We don't know what we do. That's also a crucifixion reference if you missed it. But the point is still the same. I'm getting really off topic here. That it's grounding it in a historical event, tying it to a person, and making it valid. So for us in our modern day, that's more historical evidence. We've talked a little bit in our early podcast about the significance of historical evidence for Christian thought. Like, listen, at some point you have to make that leap of faith to believe that Jesus died and rose again. But
Mhm.
just because you have to make a leap of faith doesn't mean that it's totally blind and that you're jumping a mile, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of ground that is true and valid, and that can be confirming and validating for us as believers to make us feel a little more calm. But it also can be a really good bridge to help us explain to other people who have skepticism and doubt, what's going on. So this is a big line. We'll talk about the suffering. I think we're going to circle back to that a little bit. But the figure of Pontius Pilate, I think, looms large in the creed, but it looms
Mhm.
large in Christian history, even though he only has a very short role, just because of who he was as a political and historical figure.
Mhm.
Ben, did I just rant over all
No,
your
not
points?
at all. I mean, it's an important part. Like, it's true. Like, the claims of the Christian faith are grounded in history. Like, even, and this is significant too, because some people, they'll make the argument, we just believe in someone who never existed. Like, oh, Jesus never existed. Okay, well, whoever says that has not studied history, because even the vast majority of secular historians agree, yes, Jesus existed. Like the person that is talked about in the scriptures, that person existed, which is a separate claim than saying that Jesus was a son of God. So I will
Yes.
make that differentiation. But
Yeah.
that person did exist.
Mhm.
Like there's even on Reddit, of all places, the subreddit Our History, they have a separate page dedicated to like all these sources because the moderators were tired of people coming in and saying, "Well, Jesus never existed," and they were like, "All right, like this is not a serious claim in the scholarly world. Like, yes, a Jesus that is referred to in the scriptures, who started a religious movement, who essentially started Christianity, that figure did exist. Okay, like that, that is not disputed anywhere in a serious manner.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
which again is a
it's
separate
widely
conversation.
popular. It's not a tenable position to hold. You can believe whatever
Right.
you want, but
Yeah. So it is grounded in history. Like this is not just a set of ideals that we just talk about. Like there is actual history behind the faith. Yeah. So I guess I'm just reiterating that
yeah.
point. But
I mean, I like how we bounce off each other, man. It's we've always been doing this. We've been doing this since college, so it's cool. No, I'm with you.
yeah, we we do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the second reason why Pontius Pilate is significant, which I can't claim credit for this, but if you want to give me credit, I'll take it. I'll never say no to someone wanting to give me credit. But the fact that Pontius Pilate was Roman, he was not a Jew. Um,
Big deal.
yeah, which is a big deal because it shows that the people who were connected to Christ, I mean, in whatever capacity, it wasn't just Jewish people. Like the scope of Jesus's work was not just within the Jewish community. Like it involved many non-Jewish people. Pontius Pilate is one of them. So this is a significant claim by the Apostles' Creed to include a non-Jewish person, someone who wasn't even he. Like the scriptures don't even indicate if he was even convinced in who Jesus really was. Like he had no idea, but we include him, and I think that just explains Christianity is not just this thing that morphed out of an exclusively Jewish community. Like it wasn't just a Jewish movement; it involved a lot of people. I mean, you even read the scriptures. There are stories of non-Jewish people all throughout there that Jesus interacts with, which I think is a very significant claim.
Yeah.
Because at some points in history, Christianity is seen, even nowadays, it's seen as a sometimes even a something that is tied to a particular race or a particular type of culture. Like, oh, well, Christianity is just like a Western religion. It's like, no. Again, whoever says that hasn't really studied history. But again, I might be going a little off topic here, but that's another reason why Pontius Pilate is significant. I don't know if you want to say anything on that or just call
No,
it good.
no, I think it's really good. I actually never thought about the tie and the significance of that. So I'm kind of glad you brought it up. And it got me kind of wondering, like, all right, so if they're really trying to like not only root this as Jew and Gentile, like it really contextualizes Paul's writings,
Hmm.
like neither slave nor Greek or what was it, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea of its inclusiveness here. And so I didn't realize that there was like I don't want to call it entendre, like a double entendre, but like
Hmm.
a layered meaning here of including Pontius Pilate's name. I don't know. That's really cool. I guess I never thought of it that way. So, kind of thinking about how it ties into like the broader like biblical picture as a non-Jewish person myself,
Hmm.
I appreciate and I find it really interesting. And I think it's cool because in no way does it diminish like the other roots. It just talks about the scope of impact of who Jesus was, and it just ties him into
Hmm.
like history broader than just a Jewish figure. Which I guess now I'm thinking about it for the early church is probably a really big deal.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking about this now, but like even within the Christian church, you'll have these. I don't know how widespread this is, but you kind of have these voices. I don't know if they're really tied to a specific group or even a denomination. I would doubt it, but you might hear some things come up where, like, well, Jewish people who convert to Christianity are like super Christians because, like, they have like some inherently deeper tie to the faith. Which I don't know if you. I've never heard that language used, but essentially, when they're talked about, it's
It
kind of
feels
like,
that way. Yeah,
yeah,
I've heard talking about like like oh the Messianic Jews is really like I would say they have a deeper and probably what's the word I'm looking for like a richer understanding, right? Like a more vivid, that's the word, vivid
yeah,
understanding of like some of the traditions and like the uh, metaphors of like the Eucharist, like or communion or whatever you want to call it, or Passover, understanding like some of the things that are happening and probably the Gospels in particular, specifically Matthew, right,
hmm
written in particular to Jews about their customs. I would say maybe they have a leg up on that, and they might be able to experience a difference than me, who grew up in a Christian household, and the only thing I ever knew was, you know, Christmas and Easter. That was it.
yeah,
I guess that's the only two Christian holidays I've really celebrated, right? Like
mhm,
I never understood like Passover. I just thought it was a thing that people did. I didn't grow up around a lot of Jewish culture, so no,
yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense to you, Ben, but I think you're
No,
right.
it
I
does.
think
Like,
there's a special emphasis on it, but
yeah.
maybe they just have more of an understanding.
Yeah, and I'm glad you point that out because that is true. I might have overstated my point. It
No,
is true that yeah, they would definitely have a better understanding of the culture behind it and some of the meanings behind things that are represented in the scriptures and how Christ is represented a lot in Jewish customs and practices. Um, I'm glad you're forcing me to clarify my position
no,
because,
I didn't do that on purpose.
but I'm glad you did. So
Beauty of podcasting right here, guys.
Yeah. So I'm thinking specifically of a Sunday school lesson I was sitting in one time. This is many years ago, where the person teaching it actually said, and I've seen this idea represented in several places, where Jewish people, it's not just that they have a unique appreciation of the stories of Scripture and the teachings and things of Jesus Christ. It is that they actually have an inherently unique relationship with God that Gentiles will never have, and that's where I have a strong resistance against, because that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
Because that goes directly against what Paul says, not just there in Galatians. There's neither Jew nor Greek, but in other places where he outright condemns that idea.
yeah. Or even just the gospel itself and the metaphor in the gospel when upon Jesus' death, like the lightning cracks and in the temple the veil is torn, thus symbolizing the
Mhm.
the exclusiveness, the exclusiveness of God having to be reached out to and only having certain people access him, not only with like the temple of the Jews and like the Jewish hierarchy. I don't know why I can't talk today, guys. I'm so sorry. The Jewish hierarchy, right? And then being select to be pulled in there, not only as the Jews as God's select people, but the metaphor is multi-layered, right? When it's breathed open, God's spirit is quote unquote moved into the world. And then eventually later in the Acts, right, we have the descending of the Spirit upon man.
Mhm.
Quite a few things happen from there. Ben, to your point originally, yes, I, as a non-Jewish person, am very, very glad that my ethnicity doesn't limit me. But
Mhm.
I also think we've kind of really come to a good middle ground here, where we're like, but having said that, if you are Jewish and you do become a Christian, you're going to have a more rich understanding of some of the things that it's going to be harder. Like we're going to have to educate ourselves in a different way. But like
Mhm.
I'm never going to be able to fundamentally experience the joy of a Passover as a child, with like your
Yeah.
family, like participating in, like understanding what that means to like a cultural group. But that doesn't make that person or myself or you or whoever neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, right? Any more or less Christian, right? Because if our knowledge and our ethnicity dictate our Christian faith, um,
Yeah.
if you don't know what the problems with that, I think that you need to listen to more podcasts besides this one because there's a lot more than just a podcast. Like you got to need some help. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, there's just really nowhere you can go there except for who got
Yeah.
it.
Exactly.
Let me
Um,
introduce you to the person named Jesus.
right. So the third reason why suffering under Pontius Pilate is significant, and this will actually lead us into the next line, or the next part of this line, sorry, um, is that it also highlights it emphasizes the effects of our own sinful nature,
Mm,
because it shows that it's not like Christ suffered at the hands of some other divine being or some other superhuman. Christ suffered at the hands of people, uh, not supernatural beings, um, which, I mean, we could definitely spend a lot of time on this, but the fact that we have such great potential for harm and destruction, to the point where like our sins affect Christ himself. We're like, I mean, it also definitely shows the power of the incarnation that God was able to lower himself to the point where he could suffer at the hands of people. Um, but the fact that we can do that just shows the depth of uh, depravity that is present, um, in sinful nature. The fact that we can do this, like Christ suffered under a person.
And Ben, I want to take a point here to clarify your point again, I guess, but I really want to make mine is really what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So everything you said, I fundamentally agree with on a broad level, but I want to be clear on a couple terms that I think are really important when you're talking about suffering. Suffering is one
Yes.
of the most important things I think that we can understand. For some context on why this is so important to me with the creed, what we talk about a lot, and I've referenced this all the time because I'm big on this, is that it's combating Gnosticism. And we'll talk about modern day equivalents to some extent a little bit later. But fundamentally, what it's saying, what Gnostics would say is since flesh is bad and Jesus is good, right? He wasn't flesh. This is specifically a group called the Docetists,
Mm.
Doceism. I think I can spell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what they would do, they would go to like ridiculous lengths to show that Jesus was not physically harmed and suffer because that would intrude on him being God, right? So they overemphasize the divine nature of God and underemphasize the human nature. So what
Mm-hmm.
Ben is saying, if I understand you correctly, is that it's metaphoric because this can happen to him. It's emblematic that we can do this, but that a human being can also suffer this as well. Like not only
Yes.
do we have the capacity to do, we have the capacity to be done upon.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of great tragedy. More to
Yeah.
the point, though, it's important that Jesus suffered because it shows that human nature. And no other God and no other type of Christian, really religious figure, to my knowledge, or I really would feel confident saying, even though I have limited knowledge, ever um, has been able to do that or fundamentally exist and connect with humans in that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, in some ways, God is above us, or Jesus is above us, but in other ways, he's not in any way. In fact, he worked hard, or at least it seems clear in the Gospels to me, that he works to keep himself at our level and sometimes even lower, right? Like by abasing
Mm-hmm.
himself in some ways, in healthy ways, right? Not like,
Yeah.
self-flagellation, like, what is that movie, Dan Brown's book, Da Vinci Code? Yeah, don't do that.
Uh,
Because remember, flesh isn't bad. It's not that bad.
yeah.
Um, but the idea is that this all can happen and that he's fully man, but he's still going to come in and redeem it. And so I think the broader point here is they're trying to make is twofold. And just cut me off, Ben, at any point. Is one, that because he suffered, he is fully man. And two, that because he's fully man, that we can identify with him in a different way. And again, I talked about how the Gnostics were really bad about this because they wanted him to be fully God. But the farther away and the more godlike he is, and the less human he is, the less that we can connect with him in a real way. Because let's just think about this in a fundamental, really simple way. I have nothing in common with God. Full stop. If there is no Jesus, I have nothing in common with God. There's a morally perfect, absolutely infinitely powerful being
Mm-hmm.
who may or may not be loving at this point. We don't really know at that point. Like, what fundamental relationship can I have with this person? How can I understand something so large? I can't.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to me, it's a big point, the idea of suffering, because it contextualizes the human nature in the appropriate way. He's both
Yeah.
still God and man, but he suffered like a man and he can connect with you in a real way. So the claim is fundamentally relational, in my opinion. And I'm not like one of those people that's like, Christianity's a relationship. I don't do that all the time. I don't really mean to those people. If that's you, that's fine. Like that's not what I'm critiquing or anything. But I just I think it's a little more complex than that. I just don't like that language. I think it sells it short. But
Mm-hmm.
there's a truth. There's a huge piece of truth to it. It's definitely true. I just don't think it's complete the whole picture, right? So it's just not the word I want to use, but it's true. Like, it is relational in that sense. Like you connect with God in a way that other religions, right, can't. Does that make sense, Ben? Did I just get on a? I definitely got on a soapbox, but
We each take our turn. It's fine. And this is also one of the claims. So Paul, in one of his letters, says, we preach Christ crucified, which is foolishness to wait, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. This is actually what he means when he says it's a stumbling block for Jews, because Jews absolutely had that belief God could not suffer.
yeah,
That would diminish his perfection. That would diminish his divine being,
yeah,
which is the hang up for that and the Trinity. But this, in terms of like the character of God, this is a major sticking point
yes,
between Christianity and Judaism. Is
yeah. The Messiah doesn't lose, right? Because he's God's appointed soldier. So that's also a big point too. Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't think about that, Ben. Good call.